Hello viewers of YouTube, my name is WonkaVite, and in honor of spooky season, I promised myself that I was going to try to make a video a week for every week in October, and I figured what better way to start out the month and do something a little spooky than to tell some cryptid stories. So today, I'm going to be telling 4 apparently true cryptid stories. Starting with what is, for lack of a better word, the least interesting, but most well known on the entire list, we're going to be talking about Point Pleasant Mothman. Chances are, if you clicked on this video, you probably already know what the Mothman is, so I'll keep it brief. But essentially, the Mothman is an interesting one because the actual recorded encounters can go. It depends. No one actually knows. There's so much debate over whether or not what the first sighting of Mothman was. Some say it was in the 50s, and some say it was 56. Some people say it was in the even earlier 60s. But I'm gonna go with what is most people referred to as what is mostly referred to as the first encounter of Mothman, which is to say November 15th, 1966, Point Pleasant. No, it was November 12th. Sorry, November 12th. 1966, in Point Pleasant, a bunch of gravediggers saw what they claimed was a winged man flying overhead. And the most famous encounter is in my opinion, my favorite encounter is the one I'm going to tell you now. November 5th, which happened a couple days later, November 15th, 1966. Couples Roger and Linda Scarberry and Stephen Mary Mallet were driving around the locally known TNT area, which today is known as the home of Mothman, because that's where most of the sightings took place, and it's apparently where it roosts or whatever. But it was actually known as the TNT area because it used to produce explosives for the American military, but has been abandoned since the end of World War II. Anyway, so the Mallets and the Scarberrys were driving in a car down a road close to the TNT area, and when in their headlights they saw what they described as a large white creature with glowing red eyes in the vehicle's headlights. They then did the natural response, of course, and sped up trying to get away from this thing, but it apparently was able to keep up to the speed of the vehicle no matter how fast they went, just by running alongside them. It wasn't even flying, it was just running alongside them, matching their speed. Eventually it flew off, and that's the most famous story. That's the one that they told that's what started all the Mothman madness, and everything. Interestingly enough, the real true Mothman encounters only occurred for about a year. A little over a year was the only real time that Mothman was encountered, from November 12th, as I said, 1966, to December 15th, 1966, which is the date of the famous Silver Bridge collapse incident. And that was kind of where the Mothman sightings stopped. Little bonus cryptid, just because it terrifies me, and it's not on the list, but I'm going to put it in here anyway because it's attached to Mothman, and it scares the shit out of me, and it's also Halloween, so it's the perfect time to do that. The Grinning Man, aka known as Indrid Cold, was spotted around, for his second and most famous spotting was around the exact same area and the same month as the original Mothman sightings, on November 2nd, 1966. Woodrow Derenberger was on his way driving home down Interstate 77 in West Virginia when he heard a crash in front of his vehicle, and a large metallic object just landed right in front of his truck, which prompted him to stomp on the brakes. He then claimed that a man came out of the capsule and introduced himself as Indrid Cold, all the time having this unearthly grin all across his face. There's a picture I'm going to show you that it's a famous drawing of Indrid Cold, and it freaks me out. Anyway, Indrid Cold started asking Derenberger about all sorts of weird things, mostly about what was the local culture, where was the nearest town, and just general questions of humanity. And before the Grinning Man, Indrid Cold departed, he said that he would meet Derenberger again, and then he got in his flying saucer and left. Our next one's not so much a story as more of a list of encounters, because There's just been so many of them. It's probably the oldest cryptid on the list, actually. I'm talking about doppelgangers. Doppelgangers don't really need much of an introduction. They've been in popular media for a while, and everyone knows the concept of a doppelganger, right? It's a perfect clone copy of you. But both historically and fictionally, seeing your doppelganger does not usually bode well. Doppelganger horror, specifically, has been very popular lately because of things like the Mandela Catalog, and so I figured I'd talk about it for Halloween. It's one of the most famous doppelganger encounters. Um, for instance, in Paris, 1612, English metaphysical poet, yes, that was his official title, John Donne, apparently saw his wife's doppelganger on the same date of his daughter's stillbirth. Years before, there is this guy, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and he, in his 11th book of his autobiography, that's right, his 11th, there's a lot of these things, near the end, he recounts a time when he was when he was riding horseback down a trail and saw himself riding the opposite way towards him, only only his doppelganger was wearing a different outfit. Years later, he found himself riding the same trail, the opposite direction, and wearing the outfit he said his doppelganger was wearing. So that's some sort of weird premonition or vision or something like that. Probably the most interesting story of a doppelganger, and one that probably deserves its own video, so I won't get too deep into it because it's a long story, is the story of Emily Seiji. I'm probably saying that wrong. I'm sorry to my French audience. It's spelled like this. So, what's interesting about Emily's story is that she never actually saw her doppelganger. No. Everyone else did. She was a school teacher. She was a school teacher in France, and apparently accounts. This is the one that's hardest to disprove, which is why it's so interesting. She never saw her doppelganger. Everyone, like practically everyone in town, saw her doppelganger on multiple occasions and corroborated the fact that she was in one place and her doppelganger was in another, which is just freaky. Again, I won't get too deep into the story because it probably deserves its own video, and it's a really interesting story. Anyway, I'll end this segment talking about probably my favorite doppelganger story, and that is the doppelganger encounter of the 16th U.S. President, Abraham Lincoln. No, I'm not kidding. This is a real story. So apparently, on the date of his election, November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was laying down on his couch in his house, across from a mirror, and he saw a vision of himself sitting up in the mirror, looking right at him. Now, of course, he was laying down. There's no way his mirror reflection could be standing up. But the moment he stood up to go inspect the ghostly visage, it was gone. The doppelganger was gone. He then told his wife, Mary Todd, about it, and Mary Todd claimed that it was a bad omen. It was a bad omen that he would get elected for a second term and that he would die sometime during his presidency. And would you look at that, everything came true. Now, of course, you take it with a grain of salt, right? Because all of this can be, when you look at all these stories, they're very easily disproven. Like, when you think about them enough, but that's no fun. This one's a fun one, and they're also a much more recent cryptid. They're more of an urban legend, actually. And those are of the black-eyed children, or sometimes known as the BEKs, or black-eyed kids. They appeared throughout the U.S. in the 90s and sometimes in the late 80s, depending on certain versions. But the most famous encounter comes from one Brian Bethel, who was a Texas reporter. And he claims that one night, it was 96, I think is what he said. Yeah, 96. He was going to a place called Camelot Communications, which was his local area's internet provider at the time. And he was sitting in the parking lot of a movie theater that was across the street or near this communication center. And he was writing a check so he could pay off his bill. When in the parking lot, he heard a knock on his windshield. Now, what's interesting, he claimed that he never saw them. He never heard these people approach, and he never saw them disappear. They just appeared and disappeared like that, right? So it's sort of an interesting little story. So he heard a knock on his car door. He cracked his window open to see who was knocking on his door, and he saw two children that he claimed to be about 9 to 12 years old. He didn't catch the exact age, obviously. One of them was olive-skinned, according to him, and the other he said was pale, redhead, and freckled, which you probably could have accomplished all that by just saying he was a redhead. So they began to talk to him, and they told him that, hey, could you give us a ride home? We wanted to see the new Mortal Kombat movie, and we left all our money at our mom's house. Could you give us a ride home to our mom's house? And he's got this growing fear this whole time. He was, and I quote, immediately gripped by an incomprehensible, soul-racking fear. I had no idea why. So he looked at his watch, and then he told the boys that by the time he drove them anywhere and brought them back, by the time he drove them anywhere, the movie would be over, so there'd be no point in doing it, but they kept pushing. They just kept pushing, and they kept pushing, and they said things like they were just kids, and then, quote, they didn't have a gun or anything, which, needless to say, did not make Bethel feel any safer. So as he was subconsciously reaching to lock his door, he looked up and he noticed something about the kids he didn't notice before up until now. How he didn't notice it, I don't know, so don't ask me. That's his story. But he looked up and he noticed that the kids had no eyes, just black charcoal marbles. That's where their eyes should have been. So he obviously did the appropriate response, immediately put his car in drive. Before he could get out of there, and this is another direct quote, because he says that these words are burned in his mind forever, one of the kids began banging on the door and said, "We can't come in unless you tell us it's okay. Let us in." Which is terrifying. The thing about this story that scares me so much is it's like children of the corn, you know? Children are our future and blah blah blah, you know, you hear all that every day. And the idea that as an adult, something as benign as a child can be dangerous to you, it's just, I don't know, there's just something intriguing about the idea of black-eyed kids to me. They're scary. I don't want to see them, and it reminds me of things like the Serbian dancing lady, which is a real thing, which is much scarier. Search that up if you want some good Halloween scares. That one's real, by the way. At least I think it's real, because it's not really supernatural. It's just free. It's just a crazy lady. But the black-eyed kids, it's such an interesting phenomenon, and they still claim to have been seen today. And it reminds me just a little bit of the whole killer clown craze, where a lot of people dressed up as killer clowns, and there weren't actually real killer clowns. And I think people underestimate even middle school, because they're middle school age kids, right? That's 9 to 12. So I think people underestimate kids and underestimate people and how far they will go for a prank, right? I think it's not impossible that a bunch of kids probably took a bunch of contact lenses and put them on their eyes and went out to scare people. But he also said he never heard them approach, and he never saw them disappear. He just looked in his river mirror, and they just were gone. So who knows, right? It's just, I don't know. It's fun to think about, and again, if you really think hard enough, all of these have rational explanations, but that's no fun. So here we are into our final story of the video, and this one is probably the most obscure on the list, and I doubt everyone has heard of it, but it's the one that creeps me out the most because the ocean is terrifying, and I hate it with a burning passion, and thalassophobia is a rational fear, and you cannot tell me otherwise. Anyway, this is called Ninjin, which literally translates from Japanese to mean human. Essentially, this thing is a giant, white, vaguely humanoid-shaped thing that swims around off the coast of Antarctica and the Arctic Ocean. And it's about the size of a whale, which, according to encounters, is about the size of a whale. Now, this is also the one that I put the least stock in as a story. Kind of, but it's also kind of not. I'll get into it. So I'll just tell you the story. The problem with the story is that it varies a lot from telling to telling, and I could not for the life of me find the original telling. A lot of people claim that the original telling was on 2chan, which is a Japanese forum post, but I found some evidence to suggest that wasn't even the original telling of the story. But basically, the majority of the stories of the first sighting of Ninjin goes like this, where in the early 2000s, a Japanese fishing vessel was fishing the coasts of Antarctica when they saw something that was rising up from the water, and it was going to come right up to the boat, so they tried to get their boat out of the way as soon as possible, assuming it was probably a submarine, maybe even a whale in some tellings. Either way, they got their vessel out of the way and they saw this thing rise to the surface when they quickly realized that this thing was not only not a submarine, but definitely living, but definitely alive, and also definitely not like any whale any of them had seen. Keep in mind these people that were that were fishermen their whole life. They probably would have seen whales before, right? Which is interesting. So this thing had a vaguely humanoid shape, and it also was massive, and it just kind of stayed on the surface for a little bit, and as they tried to get closer, it eventually went back down under the depths and was just never seen again. As again, that's the story. That's the original version of the story. I wouldn't necessarily put too much stock into that one because there's so many different versions of that story you find everywhere. For instance, sometimes the fishing vessel is a research vessel. It's always Japanese, but it's just weird. And it's interesting to know that this one is the most recent sighting on the list as well. Like, this is the one that was sighted. All of its sightings are firmly in the 21st century. Even the black-eyed kids were first spotted in the early 80s to 90s, right? But this one originated from the 21st century. Anyway, so yes, I wouldn't put too much stock into the original story. However, this is not where the story ends, because there have been apparently sightings of it for years up to today since then, and some also some video footage. Most of the video footage is fake, but I don't know. It's just interesting to me. And the thing about ocean monsters and ocean cryptids is the ocean is so big, and we know next to nothing. We know diddly squat, like, about the ocean. Like, really? So if I were to believe that monsters exist anywhere that we haven't seen yet, I'd 100% believe that there are monsters in the ocean. Right? Because it's a big expanse. So, those were the stories. Those were stories of cryptids. And my thoughts on the whole thing. Again, as I've mentioned about the whole thing, most of these encounters and these stories, when you really think and look into them, they can be disproven very easily, right? But that's just no fun. It's no fun, especially around this time of the year. I think it's so much more interesting when there are monsters. You know? It gives us something to be curious about. It gives us a reason to be afraid of the dark, and that's so fun this time of the year. You wouldn't go up to a kid and say there's no Santa Claus, even though there's no Santa Claus, because it ruins their sense of fun and intrigue. And I believe the more we try to talk about these monsters and disprove them, the less interesting it all is. Which is why I love the stories of ones that are harder to disprove. And even with, like, you know, it's just, I feel like this whole world would be a lot more interesting if we just maybe accepted there are some things that we might never know. And with that, I leave you. Have a good spooky month. I'll hopefully see you guys next week. And goodbye.